Clyde or somebody, you let me know. Can y'all hear me now? Wait a minute. Was that a miracle that just happened? You don't know I've got a terrible sinus infection, so this is fabulous. Okay. First of all, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. Now, some of you maybe are not members of First Presbyterian, but I'm going to address all of you as if you are, because surely today everybody's an honorary member on this happy anniversary. And on behalf of the Garland County Historical Society, brochures about which are on the table below, let me congratulate you on 150 years of faith and service, starting in 1876. Wow. In 1876, Ulysses S. Grant was president. Sitting Bull wiped out Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The very first public display of electric light was held in San Francisco. And at the U.S. Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, Americans fell in love with an exotic new fruit, the banana. In 1876, Hot Springs was incorporated as a city, and in 1876, Hot Springs citizens created the First Presbyterian Church. So you might say First Presbyterian and Hot Springs have grown up together. Well, what was the community like that gave birth to First Presbyterian? Why was it formed then? Who were those first members? To start answering those questions, let's take a look at the city that produced the church. In 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase added this area to the United States, only a few trappers' cabins dotted this area. It was in the middle of a wilderness through which you had to get to it by horse or wagon along laughable paths. And when you got here, you didn't find land suitable for large-scale farming or for industries. But we had one unique resource, and I guess you know what it is: the hot thermal springs. Our 47 springs were the engine that powered the town's growth, because in the 1800s and for most of the 1900s, or much of it, people firmly believed that the thermal waters would cure or help a host of medical conditions that doctors at the time were not able to treat. So the settlers started to trickle in. In 1832, one promoter expressed a sentiment that was echoed by a lot of people: the hot springs is destined by nature to be the most celebrated and the most frequented watering place in North America. Also in 1832, the U.S. Congress passed an act to reserve the hot springs and the lands right around them for the permanent use of the federal government. Of course, that was called Hot Springs Reservation, later Hot Springs National Park. But, for years, this reservation land was completely ignored by the federal government. They didn't send any people down here. They did nothing. There were 3 families who each felt they, not the government, were the legal owners of the hot springs. And they went ahead and built bathhouses and hotels, basically squatting on what was technically federal land. And then starting in 1832, they sued each other and they sued the federal government over who really owned the springs. And it wasn't until the 1870s, 40 years later, that the suits were settled and the final ownership of the springs declared. And that led to, decades of massive confusion and ill will, and all that will turn out to be important later to the church's history. By 1854, 3,000 visitors a year were making that difficult stagecoach trip to Hot Springs, and by 1860, there were 2 rows of hotels, bathhouses, saloons, doctors' offices, and stores along Valley Street, which is what we called Central Avenue back then. Disaster struck, 1860, and I guess you know what that is too. 1860. the Civil War. And the upshot of the Civil War was that by 1863, all but a handful of people had fled Hot Springs. And by 1865, the town had burned to the ground, except for 3 homes and 1 little boarding house. Now, deserted, in ruins, Hot Springs could have disappeared from history. But the town had that resource that people still believed in, the thermal springs. And a new hot springs rose from the ashes. Some former residents returned, and many new ones, including many northern and southern veterans, came here to start new lives in a community that they thought had a future. Well, how many came? Well, between 1860 and 1870, the population of Arkansas increased 11%. That's pretty good, isn't it? Well, in Hot Springs Township in those years, the population increased 230%. Yes. And among those arrived when they started rebuilding the town in 1865 and the church was founded in 76, looking for a fresh start, were at least 25 of the church's 27 founders. The new community was soon booming, and its reputation as a premier health resort with the numbers of doctors just multiplying every year. I'm going to stop hitting that microphone. On the negative front, and this picture shows those people rebuilding Hot Springs. This is just downtown. The white frame buildings had just been built because there was nothing there after the war. And on the west side of the street, you can see a couple of chimneys left over from burned out buildings where they haven't. So, I mean, I'm pointing out, the town really just started from scratch when our founders were moving in. Now, so the town is booming now, especially with all these doctors. But on the negative front, remember that unresolved question of who owned the land around the springs, which is basically most of Hot Springs at that point. And it meant that land titles weren't secure, so people would not invest the money in nice brick or stone buildings. Hot Springs looked like a Wild West town for a long time. Now, can you imagine the church founders? Many used to, find eastern cities like Philadelphia, climbing out of a stagecoach after the long trip here and seeing their new home for the first time. I think they must have thought, seriously? Or the 1800s equivalent of, seriously? It's about 1870. Illegal gambling rivaled the thermal baths as the largest revenue producer in Hot Springs. On the one hand, Hot Springs was promoted as the city of health and natural beauty. And on the other hand, it was called Gambler's Gulch and Sin City. Those were real nicknames real newspapers gave to the town. Gambling halls, saloons, and brothels outnumbered the bathhouses, not to mention the churches. Around that time, a resident wrote, "You are aware, doubtless, that we have congregated in this place at all times a floating population of 500 or 1,000 of the most depraved characters from all parts of the world. Gamblers, robbers, thieves, bummers, loafers, beggars, most of them suffering from a loathsome disease contracted in the dens of vice." So the people who became the church founders certainly found themselves in a complicated town. Let's take a look at it. By 1871, if our founders maneuvered around the open Hot Springs Creek, they could send a telegram in the brand new Western Union Telegraph office at the Grand Central Hotel. And in 1871, they would have been reminded of how dangerous our little valley could be when floodwaters periodically swept down the Whittington and Hot Springs creeks. In 1873, they could have met Samuel Fordyce, who was on his very first visit to Hot Springs, looking for a miracle cure in the thermal waters after being told by his doctors that he had 6 months to live. He'd moved here permanently in 1876 when the church was being formed, and he lived until 1919. Also in 1873, as residents of the just formed Garland County, they would have paid taxes and registered property in our first county courthouse, which was at the corner of Oak and Orange Streets. Excuse me, it's where the red brick old high school is. In 1874, for the first time, they could ride a trolley on the Hot Springs Street Railroad car down part of Park Avenue or on Central Avenue. And if they turned down Fountain, there's Central and Fountain Street going off of it there. If they turned down Fountain Street in 1874, they could have bumped into Jesse and Frank James and Cole Younger as they camped out on Fountain Street. The next day, the gang would ride to Gulf Creek south of town and rob the Hot Springs stagecoach. In 1875, they could play. They could go to Castle Park on Park Avenue, and they could roller skate there, or they could see Bruin the beer-drinking bear. Now, if they wanted to dress up, they could attend an elegant ball at the first Arlington Hotel, which was erected in 1875, the largest hotel in Arkansas on the site of today's Arlington Lawn. Well, now we come to the very special year of 1876. In 1876, our founders could not have strolled past Bathhouse Row. Bathhouse Row did not exist. On the east side of Valley Street, which is these buildings over here, private homes and businesses and bathhouses were all jumbled up together. Now, 2 years in the future, in 78, a fire is going to burn down downtown, and the federal government will then allow only bathhouses to rebuild on the east side of the street, thus creating Bathhouse Row. But and there's the fire. That's what downtown looked like after the fire. So our founders, well, that's in their future. Pre-fire, 1876, they could have bathed at one of the bathhouses, such as the Weir and George, or they could have sought relief at an open-air thermal pool. This one, the Cornhole, they'd gone to if their feet hurt. Men at one time and women at another. They had a choice of two papers. You know, there were media wars even then. If they were Republican, the Daily Courier Advertiser, and if they were Democrats, the Daily and Weekly Telegraph, in this building in the 300 block of Central Avenue. Now, if they walked a few feet south of the newspaper office, they could shop at Thad Taylor's General Store. And they could have dined at the very fancy new Avenue Hotel on Park Avenue. This is on the site of the Yellow Brick Majestic Hotel. And when that opened in 76, it gave Hot Springs the two largest hotels in Arkansas. And oh my goodness, how they would have cheered. The railroad came to town in 1876, called the Hot Springs Railroad, or what else was it called? The Diamond Joe? The Diamond Joe, right? The first one chugged into its depot on Benton Street, which is what Convention Boulevard is called today. That's the site of the convention center today. For $2.50, they could ride it to the Iron Mountain train at Malvern, get on it, and then just go anywhere in the world. Now, in 1876, they would have been among our now 2,500 residents who celebrated as Hot Springs was incorporated as a city, and they would have voted for our first mayor, Isaac Carhart, and Dr. William Berry, one of our first city board of directors. And they would have applauded Dr. Berry as he wrote the first city ordinances, including one that said people must keep their pigs out of the streets. This is an actual mid-70s picture taken by J.F. Kennedy of pigs in the Hot Springs Street. One visitor in 76 wrote, "There must be millions of pigs of all sizes and colors running at large. You can understand how pleasant pedestrianism is." Now, you didn't have to go to one of those saloons. You might have belonged to the Citizens and Visitors Benevolent Society or the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, the Masons Lodge number 62, the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, and teetotalers could have signed up with the United Friends of Temperance, which was a pretty brave thing to do in a town with so many saloons. Now, let's suppose one of our founders broke the law. They would have been escorted to our first jail, which is, again, near the site of the convention center. They might have been arrested by our one town constable, by the county sheriff, or one of his 3 deputies. Now then, of course, they would have wanted to talk to one of our town's 12 lawyers. For other kinds of advice, they had 2 brokers and 2 insurance agents. They would have seen 23 boarding houses and 17 hotels, accommodating the increasing number of visitors. And they could have gone to a phenomenal number, 23 numbers of doctors. Just phenomenal for a town of this size. They had a choice of 3 dentists and 7 drugstores. A few years later, a reporter would say that if by chance he threw a stone in Hot Springs and didn't hit a doctor, he'd be sure to break a drugstore window. And there's a doctor and there's a drugstore. They could have dined at 7 restaurants and shopped at 22 groceries, 4 butchers, 10 dry goods, 2 jewelers. Well, Cooper Brothers didn't show up. There it is. They could have shopped at 2 jewelers, 2 booksellers. I love the fact that we had 2 booksellers. 1 fancy goods and notions, 1 confectionery, and they had a choice of 6 barbers and 4 dressmakers. Of course, life back then revolved around horses. They could have patronized 3 stables, 1 stockyard, 4 blacksmiths, 2 harness makers, 1 wagon maker, and 1 wagon yard. They also had 1 library, 1 laundry, and 2 undertakers. Now, our 27 founders would no doubt have avoided the 18 saloons listed in the city directory of 76 and the many more saloons that weren't actually recorded in the city directory. And maybe they also stayed out of the 3 cigar stores and 2 billiard parlors. As 1876 began, they would have walked or ridden past 6 churches dotted throughout town, but not yet a Presbyterian one. So what was the religious picture like here in 1876? Well, in the early 1800s, guess who was the first recorded denomination to arrive in Arkansas? The Baptists. Very good. And one of those Baptist pioneers, and I cannot tell you how rare and unusual this picture is. The pictures of this lady do not exist, and we found one. One of those was Sarah Hale, the wife of John Hale of the Hale Bathhouse. She spearheaded, she was always the real leader of this church, the creation of the very first church in Hot Springs. In 1936, she built a log cabin Baptist church. This is a drawing of it in the church records, near where Maxine's is today, kind of at the base of West Mountain. Now, in 1876, the Baptist church, still run by Sarah Hale, was near the Hale House on the east side of Hot Springs Creek. And of course, the direct descendant, that's what it looked like in 76, and today, this is what that church looks like, of course. A Methodist, got any Methodists out there? I know you're honorary Presbyterian today, but here we go. A Methodist preacher named Samuel Morris organized the initial Methodist church here with 27 members who met in a log cabin church at the corner of Central and Park. By 1871, they had another little building on Park Avenue, but it burned. Then in 1876, they had just started constructing this church, which was at the corner of Central Avenue and Chapel Street downtown. It was finished in 1880. And this church's descendant, of course, is the First United Methodist Church on Central. What about the Episcopalians in 1876? This was their church, a wood-frame church on the north side of Spring Street, across the street from where St. Luke's is today. They had started meeting here in 1863, first using the Baptist church for their services, as did the Methodists. Sarah Hale let everybody use the Baptist church until they built one of their own. Now, in 1876, the African American community was served by two churches. Roanoke Baptist Church, now at 315 Weddington, had organized in 1863 under a brush arbor. And by 1876, they had a wood church at the corner of Whittington and Ozark Streets. And that was replaced, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of that one, but it was replaced in 1915 by this church, which was used for many, many years. There's their cornerstone laying. In 1868, the Reverend Henderson Patillo had organized Visitors Chapel AME Church congregation. In 1876, when First Presbyterian was founded, they were meeting in a wooden church across the street from the train depot, the same site that their 1913 church building stands today. The Roman Catholics had organized St. Mary's of the Springs in 1869, and that same year built this frame church at the junction of Whittington and Central, same location, of course, the church is today. In 1876, they were still meeting in that particular building. And in 1872, 20 local families had formed Temple Beth Israel Congregation House of Israel, one of the first Jewish congregations in Arkansas. And in 1876, they had just started meeting in their new building at the corner of Quapaw and Market Streets. So that's the other denominations in 1876. What about the Presbyterians? Well, a traveling Presbyterian minister conducted the first Presbyterian service in Arkansas in 1812. And the first of several Presbyterian churches in the States was formed in Little Rock in 1828. And of course, in May 1876, the Presbyterians formally organized here. Well, who are their charter members? The men and women willing to make that great investment of their time and their work and their money to start a brand new church. Let's meet them. Oh, they're organizing. It was noted in the Arkansas Gazette. And here they are. They were 8 men and 19 women. Yes. Oh, go back, okay. The women outnumbered the men, but the leadership roles, as you'll notice, of 2 elders and 3 deacons were held by men. Now, except for Miss Libby Conger, and her name is misspelled on this church document, it's Libby. She was the daughter of another charter member, so there's mother-daughter combination. Except for her, all of the women are listed as Mrs. There were 6 married couples. 13 of the women joined singularly, even if they may have been married. Perhaps, their husbands hadn't joined. Only 3 were working women, a postal clerk and 2 teachers. Although some were identified by their Christian names, Mrs. Martha Harrison, for example, 6 were listed only by their married names. Don't you hate it when they used to do that? Like, that person's got a name. It's just not Mrs. John Smith. So, we have learned from census records who most of those women were. For example, Mrs. Hieronymus was Elizabeth, Mrs. McDowell was Sally, and Mrs. Greaves was Mary. Looking at them statistically, a few things are noticeable. Now remember, a huge proportion of Hot Springs population after the Civil War came here from elsewhere. Y'all remember that? Census records of our 27 charter members bear this out. Only 2 of the charter members were born in Arkansas, and only 1 had been born in Hot Springs. Everybody else immigrated here from states including Virginia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Iowa, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and North Carolina. Their places of origin included northern and middle and southern states. I just think this is fascinating. And because the congregation's makeup reflects the fact that incredibly rarely for a small southern town in 1876, Hot Springs was a cosmopolitan city. The church founders were all young. A couple were in their 40s, but most of them were in their 30s. And a few, all of these women were in their 20s, and Miss Libby was 18. Of course, the youth is not a surprise. People willing to uproot and move to a new city and new town and make a fresh start in their lives are probably going to be younger people. At least 2 of the women were widows, one of the postal clerks and one of the teachers. One postal clerk and one of the teachers. And the censuses show that many of the married charter members had young kids, so there were a lot of little children involved in this. One elder was Dr. William Berry, remember him, who got rid of the pigs? He joined with his wife. He was a 39-year-old doctor from South Carolina. The other elder was Jacob Hieronymus, who joined with his wife. He was a 32-year-old dealer in hides from Virginia originally. Now, among the deacons, Alfred Whittington, 32-year-old businessman, is the only charter member who'd been born in Hot Springs. His wife, Eliza, from Missouri, was also a charter member. Deacon Linus C. Young was the proprietor of the National Hotel. Back up. Oh, back up. There we go. I got really excited. I found this National Hotel in our wonderful photo collection. Can you see National Hotel there? That's what he was proprietor of. Across the street from the library and a drugstore. So he was that proprietor, and he was a really dedicated man. He was also recording secretary for the YMCA and financial secretary for the Friends of Temperance. And the last deacon, Dr. Charles Reed, at 44 was the oldest of the charter members from South Carolina and was, of course, a physician. The other charter members included a carpenter and his wife, the wife and daughter of the manager of the new Hot Springs Railroad that had just come to town, and the wives of a doctor, a plumber, a policeman, a dentist, and a bathhouse manager. I think we can assume that all of these people were dedicated to their religion and committed to building a church that would grow with the growing community. So let's get to know just a handful better. Their leader was undoubtedly Dr. Berry. He had moved to Hot Springs just in 1875, a year before the church was founded. He'd started a medical practice and also an amazing amount of civic work. He was a leader in the drive to get us incorporated in 76. Also in 76, he's on the first city council, as we said. In 76, he was elected president of the Arkansas State Medical Association and is the driving force in the creation of this church. He served as elder and Sunday school superintendent, choir director, and clerk of the sessions of the church almost continuously from its beginning until well past the turn of the century. Oh, and after 1876, he'd be the first president of the Hot Springs Medical Society, president of the City Board of Health, state representative in the Arkansas legislature, and a founder of the Hot Springs School District. I can barely say that. After his death in 1916, a newspaper wrote, Dr. Berry has been perhaps more closely identified with the upbuilding of Hot Springs and her institutions than any other pioneer of this resort. Now, he was a truly compassionate man, a real philanthropist. In the days before there was any government help for indigents, he created a charity hospital, and it was on the second floor of the old wooden firehouse just off Whittington Avenue. This is when it was still used as a firehouse, but he took over the second floor of that. Now, one poor man he treated there told him, I'm going to leave you my money when I die. And Dr. Berry didn't for a minute believe that this man had a dime to his name, of course, as he took care of him. Well, when the man died, it turned out he had $2,000 and he left it to Dr. Berry. $2,000 back then was a lot of money. And he could have done a lot of things for himself with that money, but instead, he bought 4 properties on West Grand and built a bigger charity hospital. His own home was about a block away from that charity hospital on Grand. Now, church member Mrs. Roy Gillenwater told a story that says a lot about Dr. Berry. Quote, there was a confirmed drunkard in our church, and several members of the session wanted to turn him out of the church. Dr. Berry and some others insisted that the church was the place for him. It was a very hot argument, and so they decided to table it indefinitely. Then, upon hearing that Dr. Berry was ill in bed and couldn't attend a meeting, they decided to hold a special session meeting. Dr. Berry's voice would have been on the side of the drunkard, of course. They were getting ready to vote when an ambulance drove up and Dr. Berry was brought in on a stretcher. His voice was the deciding one, and the man remained in the church, and Ms. Gillenwater said, incidentally, the man was rehabilitated and made a good church member. Yes. Another well-known charter member was Alfred Whittington. His father, Hiram Whittington, is going to be donating land to the church. Now, Hiram was unfortunately a Unitarian and never joined First Presbyterian, but his son Alfred, always called Alf, was a very active member until his death in 1913. And he and his wife Eliza could very quickly get to church because they lived in this splendid house just about a block away where Park Avenue begins. His obituary called him one of Hot Springs' wealthiest and most philanthropic citizens. I think he was a charter member who had the most money by far. He was an early investor in the bank that later became Regions. He helped start the YMCA, was an early school district director, and in 1876, he was also worthy master of the Masons. Throughout his life, he was very generous to the church, not just with his money, but with his time and his leadership. Here's a story from a church history ministry. Alf Whittington at one time gave a communion set to the church. At that time, they were using one chalice, which was passed around from one member to another. A man sat in front of Mr. Whittington who had a long red beard. Mr. Whittington said he had taken his communion, strained through that red beard for just about as long as he wanted to. So he bought a set with individual cups. Other charter members may not have been as prominent or wealthy as Berry or Whittington, but they were also sterling members of the community. For example, and this is the best I could do with this one drawing I found of her, Julia Sullivan Kenner. Can you kind of see she's a very pretty lady, isn't she? She was a resident of Hempstead County. She was educated at Minden, Louisiana, and at the age of 14, she taught at the academy there to pay her own way through school. And later, she taught there to educate her two brothers and a sister. She and her doctor husband were living in Louisville, Arkansas when he died in 1872. So in 1876, she and her 13-year-old daughter moved to Hot Springs, helped form the church, of course, and also in that year, she organized Crest School. Now, this school had other locations and names, but eventually it turned into Ramble School. Any of you attended Ramble School? All right, Julia started your school. She couldn't contribute much monetarily to the church on her salary of $35 a month, but she contributed greatly in other ways. She wrote a lot about the Bible. She particularly liked to draw parallels between the Bible and history, and she was brilliant. She taught Greek, Latin, Spanish, and French, and had a deep knowledge of astronomy. And she taught until her death in 1903. So as we've seen, one characteristic of the charter members, such as Julia, is their respectability. One of them, though, might have caused an eyebrow or two to be raised, and that was Mrs. Anna Flynn. This is her husband, Frank Flynn, who did not join the church. He was certainly well off, but what does he look like he does for a living? He's a professional gambler. Now, Anna and Frank had come to Hot Springs in 1871 when saloons and gambling houses were operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and times were really wild. One example, the petition sent to the governor asking for our incorporation in '76 cited the great need for law enforcement, saying that on Sunday mornings the saloons and gambling halls were open and drunks were sleeping on the sidewalks, hindering people on their way to church. Now, more structure was imposed on the town after incorporation, but saloons, prostitution, and gambling were still permitted, and Frank was the gambling king. In 1876, he operated 7 gambling halls. Now, also in '76, while Anna is attending the organizational meetings of the church, Frank was on trial for shooting and killing a former deputy sheriff in a bar that same year. He was not convicted, but, my goodness. He was reaching for some respectability, like he invested with Sam Fordyce in the first water system, but his business was gambling and saloons. And when his control of gambling was threatened by a rival faction in 1884, he was at the heart of an infamous and well-known bloody shootout on Central Avenue. So here's Anna in 1876. She's the wife of the most notorious man in Hot Springs, becoming a charter member of First Presbyterian. And I would love to talk to her, know more about her. Was this a calculated move to increase her family's respectability? Was she a sincere Christian who regretted his actions? And what was it like for her to be sitting on a pew when the pastor was talking about the evils of gambling and drink? We can only imagine. Well, Dr. Berry, as we've said, was the force that collected all these charter members we've been talking about. He was the force that collected them together. There's a letter dated 1876 written by someone who knew him who said, "Talk to Dr. Berry about organizing a church in Hot Springs. He has been zealously rounding up Presbyterians." So before the formal church organization, he organized a Sunday school which met on Sunday afternoons at the Baptist church and then the Episcopalian church. And he encouraged people to start thinking about their own church building. Finally, First Presbyterian's founding by Dr. Berry, and what a church historian described as an earnest group of Christian men and women, came on May 14th, 1876. They started to build a small frame building off Whittington Avenue. Here's Whittington Avenue. This picture was taken in 2007. Thanks to Clyde Covington for this. You see the empty lot up there? Here's the church. Here's First Presbyterian. The red brick building used to be a firehouse there, and the empty lot was where the Burton Isley Clinic used to be, and on top of that is St. Mary's. That empty lot, and also where the firehouse was, that's the first church lot. Okay, that's where they started to build the first church building. But there was a problem. In 1875, the Supreme Court had put an end to that. Remember those 40 years of lawsuits and who really owns the land and what's the title of the land? They ruled finally in 1875 that the federal government did indeed own the hot springs and the land here. And this was really a blessing to the town. Now people would invest in substantial buildings, but it was bad news for First Presbyterian. As a result of that ruling, the government resurveyed all their land here, and they decided they owned that lot. And they told the congregation to find someplace else. They had to move. Well, what to do? They thought of Hiram Whittington. Now, we've talked about Hiram Whittington. This is his home. He is truly the town's founding father in commerce, civic affairs, and philanthropy. He'd come here in 1832. He was one of that handful of people who did not run away during the Civil War. He stayed with his son Alf and other relatives in this home that was right across the street. Okay? One of the rare buildings, one of those 3 homes that survived the war. And he was still living in that home in 1876 when he was visited by the church's Ladies' Aid Society. A church history recorded the Ladies' Aid Society began negotiating with Major Whittington for the purchase of the lot where the church now stands. Major Whittington, however, generously donated the lot, thus writing his name forever as one of the builders of the church. So that unfinished building was moved across Whittington Creek and placed on the lot, this lot, that was donated by Whittington. And, you know, he would have watched the church rise while he was sitting on his front porch. Well, through the years, fine pastors came and went. Members took on many worthy projects that benefited the community. There was a schism or two, but everything turned out okay. There were a few other hiccups. One popular pastor left in 1882 because his Kentucky-born wife could not get used to the lack of conveniences in what she called an unpleasant little town. But he was followed by the Reverend E.T. Baird, who remodeled the church in the early 1800s. And for the first time, isn't it pretty? For the first time, the church had a bell tower and Gothic windows. Now, sadly, he resigned and went to a church in Searcy because he had become ill from, quote, sewer seepage from the nearby creek and the manse the church provided for him behind the church. The building he left behind, can you see First Presbyterian? You can see it up there behind St. Mary's. Of course, that's Park, Whittington. The building he left behind helped to define a wonderful part of Hot Springs. Your motto is the church with a heart in the heart of the city, and this location on Whittington is truly in the heart of the city. A few steps from Central and Park Avenues, at the threshold of an avenue that has had more diverse historical impacts than we have time to go into today. And the church continued to grow. Here's some session minutes from April 11th, 1886, with Dr. Berry as clerk, that contained some statistics. In their 10th year, the total number of communicants was 50. 85 were attending Sunday school and Bible class. The church gave $25 to foreign missions, $24 to education, and $7, which was nearly $250 in today's money, to the Tuscaloosa Colored Institute. And it paid the pastor $600 for half a year's salary. Reverend French Thompson took on the challenge of building a new church, and in 1903, the church launched a project to build a 30,000 plus building, which would be nearly $1 million today. And Jeff is going to tell you, there's Jeff. Jeff is going to tell you all about this wonderful building. But here are some happy session minutes of a meeting headed by Building Committee Chair Alf Whittington, of course, and recorded by Dr. Berry, of course, in 1907, planning the laying of the cornerstone on September 12th. But you know, while the old church was torn down and the new one was built, the congregation met in the circuit courtroom of the brand new county courthouse on Ouachita. And then finally, in 1910, a communion service shared with Orange Street Presbyterian Church celebrated being in the new building. These church members in 1911 certainly look happy. But trouble was ahead. On New Year's Eve night of that year, lightning struck the church during a New Year's Eve watch party that some of the members were having in the church. Well, the building was really damaged, partially destroyed, and the congregation had to meet at the Central Theater until it was repaired. And according to Mrs. Gillenwater, when the lightning struck the church during the watch party, there was not any dignity in getting out. Later, several of the members shook their fingers and said the congregation should not have been having such a party in the church. Had those critics been there that night, they would have found out that those present were only singing hymns and saying prayers for the new year. Here's just a few notes about the church's long and eventful history since then. One of the ministers who had the most impact on the town was Reverend Chauncey Hickok. And I was talking to Bill Creason, it was someone, where's Bill? I was talking to Bill and Judy earlier, and his grandparents joined the church in 1913, correct? 1912. And his grandmother told him that she really liked Reverend Hickok. So it's nice to hear some independent conversation about what a special man he was from a third generation First Presbyterian family. In June 1913, the dynamic Reverend Hickok came as pastor, and he served till 1926. During his ministry, a church history said, the whole city felt the glow of his warm-hearted and versatile powers. Now, he died very suddenly in 1926, an early death, and the local paper said there never lived among all the citizens of Hot Springs one who combined a deeper religious example and his wide influence among all creeds. And during his ministry, the Sunday school addition was made to the church, and he helped First Presbyterian sponsor Boy Scout Troop Number 1, the oldest in Arkansas, in 1917. He was an enthusiastic Rotarian who started a lot of that club's worthy projects. He led the successful Liberty Bond drives here during World War I. He helped rejuvenate the Chamber of Commerce. Well, he certainly left the church a legacy of reaching out to serve the community. And the Boy Scout troop he'd helped form played taps at his funeral. During World War II, The church thought of ways to help some of the many members of the armed forces stationed at the Army and Navy General Hospital. Hospital Post newspaper for April 44 states, according to the 47 WACs who were entertained by members of the First Presbyterian Church a couple of Sundays ago, it's a wonderful custom that the First Presbyterian Church has started. The girls all reported a delightful day with church services, then a delicious home-cooked dinner, and in some cases, even an automobile ride. Various church members volunteered to take one or more WACs for the days, and the girls certainly did appreciate the Hot Springs hospitality. I think another highlight was in 1968 when the First Presbyterian Women, led by Barbara Britt and Mary Couch, organized the Bargain Box resale shop, of course, which has raised money for worthy causes for 58 years now, and as you can see, nothing is going to stop the Bargain Box. In 1994, the pipe organ was completely rebuilt. And then, of course, an organ has long been a beloved part of this church. But a church program from May 29, 1927 suggests that unnamed somebodies had been up to unappreciated shenanigans with the organ. The parishioners that morning read in their programs, "If the organ gives forth unwished notes this morning, it is not the fault of the organist or the choir or the pastor. Address your comments to the ones responsible." Of course, the church has always been known for the quality of its music. It certainly is today. And the choir was for many years an integral part of the wonderful Christmas carol services staged each Christmas Eve against the backdrop of Hot Springs Mountain overlooking Arlington Park. And the church shared honors for many years with First Methodist in playing host to presentations of the Messiah and Elijah. Today's magnificent church building is a far cry from the very first one. That first one, according to a member, was quite uncomfortable. She said it was hot in the summer and cold in the winter, and the pews were hard. She said, quote, "Since we had no screens on the windows, we had a full congregation of flies, wasps, and bees. Since there was no nursery, the children had to sit through church, which didn't make for peace or quiet or concentration. And when the building was moved across the street, of course, the wasps, bees, and flies moved with it." The same lady reported that some people had not always approved of activities the church ladies conducted to raise money. She said at one time bazaars were held in the church until one minister stopped them, saying it wasn't dignified to have selling in the church. And she added, quote, "Now a Presbyterian may be many things, but above all, he or she must be dignified." I think it's safe to say that First Presbyterian members have indeed been dignified and also faithful, dedicated, and compassionate. And I think that the 27 church founders would be very proud today of today's church members as they study together, they work for the church together, they work for the community together, they have fellowship together, and of course, first, last, and always, they worship together. 150 years ago, Dr. Berry and the other charter members dreamed of a church where spiritual needs would be met and where there would be opportunities to grow and serve. First Presbyterian, the church with a heart, is truly the fulfillment of their dream.
Jeff Carr, and he has done some research not only about our cornerstone, the architectural building of this church, but also stained glass windows. So I'd like to welcome Jeff Carr.
Good morning. Just a second here. So this is a very brief talk on the history, and Liz I got to be even briefer because we had quite a bit of overlap, but that's just fine. So as mentioned, May 14th, 1776, the church was formed. This was organized by the recently formed Ouachita Presbytery for our church governance. In 1878, the church bought the records describe a dilapidated building sitting across the way. This kind of shows where it was, and definitely you can see part of the old firehouse. Our records say that where the church was built originally, that's where the firehouse went, so there's a little bit of difference. If you want to compare the differences between ours, we can do a quiz later and see what's... In 1882, the small church was demolished and a new church had begun. The records indicate that the sale of the land was done in, it was done in good faith. They bought it from somebody. It wasn't just slipping money under the table. But as Liz said, the property lines weren't enforced. They weren't tracked. The government was really, really lax about their property lines. In fact, they pretty much ignored it. But as the town was growing, there were a lot of complaints because people wanted to know, where is your property, government, and where can ours be? So they resurveyed and then came out, and the federal guy came out and said what Ronald Reagan says are the most feared words in America: I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And in helping, he said, you got to move because it's on our properties. Our church, our records state that the ladies of the church were involved in negotiating with Hiram Whittington, and it seemed to go on for some time before he donated the land. And I have to wonder if the ladies back then were as dedicated, determined, and persistent back then as some are today, whether or not Major Whittington just finally threw up his hands and said, just take it. The records don't show that, but it does say that it was generously donated by Major Whittington. So however it was acquired, through either badgery or philanthropy, off we went. And they met in that building, and we show that in 1882, they started a new church building, and it was partially finished before they were told they had to move it. And they got the land from Mr. Whittington, or Major Whittington, and they moved it across the street. And Miss Gillenwater had some very fun comments about it, but here's one that we found also, was on the wasps and flies and bees that came across the street with it. One Sunday, a wasp was really getting some attention because it was flying around, and it really paid attention and fell in love with one bald gentleman's head. And when it finally landed on him, he jumped up and ran screaming out of the church. On October 12th, the session approved authorization of a new church building, and in 1905, the decision was made to hire an architect, Mr. Charles Thompson, to design the building. This was going to be done for an estimated cost of $25,000, and then the Jacoby Art Glass Group was hired to do the stained glass windows. And in early 1907, with the raising of the old church, the new church was begun. And as Liz said, during the 3-year construction process, they met at the Garland County Courthouse. So Mr. Thompson was an interesting guy. He was a self-taught architect. He started as a draftsman in Chicago and then later moved to Little Rock, where he continued as a draftsman working for a Little Rock architect, Benjamin Bartlett. But while he was doing that, he continued his studies to become a full-fledged architect, and in 2 years, he did just that, and he became a full partner in the company. This, by the way, is what Mr. Thompson would have looked like about the time he designed this church. That's the vintage of this picture. So Bartlett, in 1890, moved out of state, and Mr. Thompson took over the operation and started a 40-year successful practice, and he worked with many talented draftsmen. He was considered the most popular and prolific architect in the state, and he was known to have a meticulous attention to detail. He designed everything: houses, industrial buildings, the courthouses, college dormitories, and churches. He designed this church in the late Gothic Revival style. This features typically pointed lancet arches, steep gables, large stained glass windows. And while it's not a medieval Gothic building, it's part of the American Gothic Revival, which was a thing back in the 1880s up through about 1920s, 1930s. So we started a new church building. They hired a superintendent, William Kerr, out of Colorado Springs, who was a well-known contractor. The cornerstone was laid, as Liz said, September 12th, 1907, and in it was sealed supposedly the only copy history of the church up to that point. And then on October 2nd, 1910, of course, it was completed, and they had a joint joint communion service of the Orange Street Presbyterian Church. The cost of the building was arguably within budget, $30,000. This money was mostly raised by church members, but they did take out a small mortgage to finish it up. Of the $30,000, the stained glass windows, the plaster work, heating and plumbing portion were all done for $13,000. And as she noted, that on New Year's Eve, during that evil watch party, lightning struck the church. There was substantial damage, but it was quickly repaired, and the session notes show that in April of 1912, it was back up and running. Speaking of the cornerstone, I was tasked a few months ago to investigate the time capsule that was in the cornerstone. And I was skeptical, never heard that, and I go, well, how do you know what's there? And I was told, because they said so. So they said Bill Creason was going to pull it out a few years ago, but he didn't. We ran out of time for the 125th. And I go, well, how does he know it's there? Because they said so. So I got looking to see who is this they and what might be in there and what are we dealing with. So the bottom picture shows what how it would have been sealed in. But I got looking with a stonemason at our block. This is made out of Indiana, or also known as Bedford limestone. Bedford limestone weighs 150 pounds per cubic foot. So this is a solid stone, no breaks, no cuts. So it weighs upwards of 800 pounds. And it has on it, of course, hand chiseled on the side. There are a couple of Bible sayings, one on each of the sides, and the front has our name and the date. So how do we pull that out? Well, we had a kind of a big issue. There's our little cornerstone, and you can see what's sitting on it. It's about 60 feet of Indiana limestone at the 150 pounds per cubic feet. So the stonemason and I got on our calculators, and we figured it weighs upwards of 24,000 pounds. And he said he wouldn't even attempt to pull it out, because if you pull it out, that column's going down and likely taking the bell tower with it. But he had a couple ideas. He said, well, maybe we could cut into it. We could cut down with a diamond saw and cut across. So you'd have to chisel it away, maybe take 4 or 6 inches down. But in doing so, you're going to lose part, we would lose part of the verbiage on either side. We would lose the front piece. And looking at it further, he said, well, you know, the stone's on top. There's a smaller one on top of it. I could maybe take that out by drilling through this 100-year-old mortar and then chipping it away, prying it away, probably destroying the block. But you saw that prior picture of that box was steel, and they're not made to twist up and go around through a small hole. So once again, you have to cut out the top of the front of the stone, and we replaced it, tried to put it back. Nothing would match. It would look old, new and old and repaired, and pretty much decided we didn't want to do that. But then we also decided, we looked at the precedents from that one block, and that was from the Parker Memorial Hospital. They tore it down, and lo and behold, there's this time capsule. They had no idea it was there. So you can see it was sealed, it was a tin box, sealed shut, but when they opened it up, what they found inside was distressing, because any kind of paper kind of looked like that. So based on that, what you'd have to destroy part of the stonework, and what we get might not even be working, because some of the paperwork that was in there was literally powder. There was just nothing left, so we decided against it. Remodels. The church has gone through a few remodels, three big ones in 1941, 65, and 82. And then in between, it had a host of smaller remodels, but I'm going to touch briefly on the big ones. In 1941, a big addition was made where we put on what is now Fellowship Hall. The old Fellowship Hall was right behind this wall, and interestingly, it didn't have a ceiling on it per se. It opened up to the very top of the church, and it had a balcony around it, and it had a whole bunch of little rooms around it, classrooms, and so people could come out of the classrooms, they could look down into Fellowship Hall. So that was reconfigured. They added a floor and a ceiling, and they changed the stairs. One set of stairs is still there, so currently, right here is Leslie's office, and here's the other church office. Those stairs are still there. These stairs disappeared. This was all reconfigured, covered up, and then the stairs to our upper balcony back here were reconfigured. You can see on this that the way we used to go into it back then was you go out that door, make a left, and start climbing stairs that would curve to the right. They tore those out, and now you go straight through, climb the stairs, and kind of trend to the left as you climb up. At that time, the stained glass windows were covered and pretty much forgotten. They also replaced the electrical system and brought it up to code. They put new lighting in the sanctuary, and in the new Fellowship Hall, of course, they added a kitchen. In 1965, following federal mandate that there had to be wheelchair access in any public buildings, they decided to put it on this side, so they added this doorway to the back right and put that little alcove, and then the wheelchair was, you could wheel up there into the church. In 1982, they got rid of a small little schoolhouse that was attached, that held the bargain box and was used by the Boy Scouts. So this was demolished, and this new section in the back was put on, which now holds, of course, the bargain box, the choir room, and the library. Although the use of these rooms keeps changing around, so where the library is, that's where the choir room was, and where the choir room now is where the Boy Scouts met, until we got their other building and let them put it in there. And then, of course, 1994, they put in a new pipe organ. The original one was put in 1926, and it was a beauty. It was a very, very good pipe organ for its time. But over 40 years, it just kind of went downhill and more repairs, so they decided to opt to replace it. Now, this is an even bigger and fancier one, so the pipes behind that wall, there's a massive amount of pipes, and it takes up so much room that we had to close off one of the classrooms upstairs, and some of us that are of the right age remember meeting in that Sunday school in that class, but that is gone now in order to hold more of the pipes. In the late 90s, the session voted to put in a columbarium, and they're putting it back here where the stairs are. They're putting it underneath the stairs where there's a little used closet just sitting there, empty space. And during the construction, the windows were discovered. The builder came in to me and he says, "Do you know there's two stained glass windows behind those walls?" It's like, no. So we quickly decided to incorporate those into the design. And so one is in the columbarium, so it floods it with this beautiful light, and then as you go up the stairs, there's another one was exposed. And around that same time, the narthex bathroom was redone, but this time, knowing there were stained glass windows back there, we just incorporated those in the design from the get-go. A little word on our stained glass. As I mentioned, they're manufactured by Jacoby Art Glass, which is located in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was a business from 1896 to 1970. St. Louis in those days was home to a big German population, and many of these Germans were versed in the art of making stained glass. And there were several stained glass companies that were in business in St. Louis, to the point that it became the primary center for stained glass in the country in those times. Unfortunately, most of the early records of the company have been lost or destroyed, but I was able to find that our windows were likely designed by Mr. H.G. Gilmore, and his two main helpers, designers, were Ben Finkelstein and Mills T. Oliver. Those were the main drivers for these two windows. Of course, they had a lot of help on there. The windows are also in the Gothic Revival style, which is characterized by real tall vertical compositions, jewel-like deep reds and deep blues, strong religious narrative scenes, and strong lead tracery patterns. So the leaded portion is a prominent portion of the glass. Well, as a side note, Jacoby Glass also did the glass in St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in town. We have approximately 30 stained glass windows in this church. During the several remodels, some were covered up, and it looks like some were removed off on the back side, but there's no pictures. I couldn't find any kind of details about whether they were actually stained glass or what. But strong narrative scenes, each of these windows tells a story. So over here we have the Gethsemane window, which takes from Luke 22, which tells us that after the Last Supper, Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives and said to the people, prayed, he said, "Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet let not my will, but yours be done." And on this side we have the Ascension window, which tells the good news of Easter from Luke 24, tells us that Jesus led them out as far as Bethany, lifting up his hands, he blessed them, and when it came to pass, while he was blessing them, he was parted from them and carried up into heaven. Another stained glass that some of you can see, some might not, but back of the balcony is the Christ knocking on the door. That's the balcony window, which comes from Revelations 3:20 that says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him, and he will dine with me, and I will dine with him, and he with me." In other words, we're saying that Jesus is knocking at the door of our hearts every time we sense we need him, and we turn to him. He is patient and persistent in trying to get through to us. A couple of the newer stained glass, this is the Lamb of God window, which is out through those doors, and it was put in when the Walter Street door was added. When this was being built, fortuitously, the old St. Joe Hospital across the way was getting rid of, tearing down a chapel. So our own Dr. Stuart McConkie negotiated with them and bought this window and brought it in, and we incorporated it into the alcove. We have another one, the Christ is a Good Shepherd window, which is located in the church office, and it was noted that it was given by the deacons in memory of a member, Martin Elam, who died in 1963. It was installed in 1965, but I couldn't find any records of where this came from. Was it made strictly for him? Was it an older one that was modified? I've cut out, unfortunately, the bottom part has in memory of Mr. Elam, but there it is. And the final note on this is that in 1967, these windows, big ones, were removed and sent off to be repaired, reworked. They had to re-lead them and just rebuild them, which happens occasionally with these windows. And when they came back, we put plexiglass on the outside, which might be bulletproof, but it was definitely put on to prevent further damage, some of which was done by some of our local miscreants who brought their BB guns down and were using it for target practice. So this stopped that. And then in 1968, the balcony and the smaller windows were pulled out and protected. And I mentioned there's it's ongoing maintenance. It's just a given because you're working with lead. They're sealed with lead, which is soft. It's very prone to damage from thermal cycling, getting hot in the summer, cold in the winter. Lead will oxidize and it will sag just from the weight, and structural movement of the building can cause those things to move a little bit. But we've had surprisingly good life out of these things, and I think that goes back to the quality of the build from Jacoby Art Glass.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, ma'am.
So is that considered one window that they use?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
On October 29th, 1955, catastrophe. There was a massive explosion up at Lindell Park. At that time, it was a gravel pit. And the police had a firing range up there because gravel absorbs the bullets. And the city had some use for it now and then. Well, on the 29th, their use was disposing of some old dynamite. Now, if you're not used to playing with dynamite, you may not know that an accepted way to get rid of it is to burn it, because fire will not set it off. Unfortunately, they either set it, where they piled up the dynamite to burn it, it was either sitting on a live round, or somebody had missed it. There was a blasting cap in one of the sticks. But whichever it was, when that fire reached it, that exploded, and that's how you set off dynamite, and that whole pile went up. And it pretty much vaporized 3 people, a police lieutenant, a street commissioner, and a city worker. Now, the orientation of that gravel pit was kind of like this, and so it kind of aimed that shock wave down east on Whittington, and it blew out a lot of glass. It went down Central, and it blew out glass on the east side of Central as it traveled south. And in fact, there was glass broken as far south as Spencer's Corner. Now, people in Arkadelphia were calling up because they could hear it, called up to ask what in the world had happened. And as most of us can remember, 1955 was Cold War. So with this big mushroom cloud that went up, people saw that, and they thought the Russians were attacking us, and the Russians had dropped an atom bomb on Hot Springs, Arkansas. We had some damage. The Gethsemane window was badly damaged, and it was either repaired or replaced, but I couldn't find which it was, but I bet it was Jacoby that did it. So there we have it. First Presbyterian Church, church with a heart in the heart of the city. And thank you for your time.